Image editing techniques evolve and improve over time. So what may have been a time-consuming and difficult manipulation maybe just a few years ago could, with the help of the AI tools we now have, be much easier and with better results. We've seen quite a number of improvements over the past year or so with AI masking in Photoshop and Lightroom and also AI noise suppression. But of course we now have AI generative fill on the horizon, and that's going to be a game changer. And I'm not overstating things here. Images that would have needed too much of our time to complete possibly would have been cast aside for something easier. But what about now in 2023? Here's an example of an image I shot in 2009. Now the main editing issues here are going to be the exposure, maybe the noise we create from that exposure, and of course it's shot with 400 ISO, and we have to deal with those horrendous highlights. At the time this image was shot, it would have taken all of my Photoshop skills and a fair amount of my time, but not now. Let me show you what I mean. With the image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, we're going to begin with basic global edits first, beginning with a crop and possibly a rotate. I think we can lose that highlight on the left-hand side. Let me just unlock that so I can vary this on all four sides. I think I could lose a little bit of the top, not too much, and maybe a little bit on the right. But it would be quite nice if I could just tilt the eyes a little bit. Let's move my cursor to the right. I can tilt it that way or that way, whichever I feel is appropriate. I think that way is a little bit better. But I don't want the ear to go too close to the edge. I think I'm more or less happy to select that. And I'll hit the Enter key. And we'll begin from that point. I think I'd like to take a look at the color balance. I'm going to go to my eyedropper tool. I know that the white areas here should be white, so if I click into them, you'll notice there's a slight difference there, but I'm going to begin with the exposure, contrast and clarity here. Quite often, I'll click the Auto button and I'll allow the auto settings to take place, and then I'll manipulate my image from there. I think that looks pretty good, but I would like to see it slightly darker. Maybe I would want to just spread the blacks and whites a little more. I'm looking up at my histogram to make sure I don't burn things out, but most of the brightest highlights we're going to have to deal with anyway. So that doesn't look too bad. Let's move down to clarity. We'll have just a little bit of clarity back to the exposure. I'll drop that back a little bit. And maybe even just a touch more in the vibrance. Now the one thing I'm not too keen on here is that in making these changes, both automatic first and then tweaking those, treating those as a starting point, I'm not too keen on the lime colour of the green in the background. So I think I'll deal with that next, and I'm going to do that via the colour mixer. Click in the colour mixer. I think I'll look at the hue and see if I can adjust that, see what effect I get. So if I click the hue first and then click the targeted adjustment tool, I can click into that and I can move my cursor one way or another. Here I make it a little bit worse, but if I drag it back a bit, not quite so lime green, although it does warm it a little bit. But then if I select saturation and the targeted adjustment tool, then maybe I can take the saturation down. So I've taken that lime green away. Now I'd like to turn to some strategic editing, and I'm going to begin by going to my masks here. I'm going to choose a linear gradient, click and drag down from the top. Now I want to darken this area and this area, not too concerned about the light area on the right hand side. We're going to deal with that with AI a little later. But you can see that we've got a problem encroaching on the ears of the animal, and I don't want to darken them. But what I think I'll do to start with is to drop the exposure at the top. I'm going to take it down as far as I think I dare. But if I feel I'm encroaching too much on the ears here, then one of my favourites in masks is to choose to subtract from my mask, pick up the brush, look at the flow rate, it's around 20, 25, something like that. Now I can choose to zoom in a little bit if I want to. And what I can do now is just brush over those areas to remove any shading on the areas that I want to remain quite light, because I think they're quite important areas in this image. It doesn't matter too much about the top of his head, but I don't want these white outlines of the ears to be affected by the shading at the top. Doesn't take too long, as you can see. I can hit Control 0 and there we have the image fitted back on screen. I think the next weakness is on the left hand side, so let's do the same again with the same mask. But let's use the shortcut keys of G, touch the G key, and I can click and drag. Now you can see I've got a similar problem here with the ear, so we may have to do the same thing again. Sometimes we can work in slightly different ways by removing parts of the shading from areas we don't want to affect, but I think it's often better to see what we're doing first. So I want to darken down that left hand side, maybe a little bit of blacks, a little bit of whites, and once again subtract, brush, and if I feel it's appropriate I can take away any shading in an area that I think is visually important. Now we could do more or less the same thing, I think, with the top corner there. So once again, Control G, I'm going to click and drag, do much the same, just give a little bit of darkening to the edge of the animal, but once again just remove any effect that I don't want on the area of the ear. Now let's think about the animal's face. If we look very carefully, we can see that the eye on the left has got a little more light than the eye on the right. So the next thing I'm going to try is to try to balance the eyes up. I don't have to do a lot, but I think what I'll do is zoom in. I can click and drag, get that in the center. Now you can see we've got lighter tones here than we have here. So I think I'll go back to my mask here, but here I'm going to select objects because I can very easily just paint that area and say to the AI, select that for me. I'm going to remove that overlay so we can see where we're beginning from. I'll raise the shadows, maybe raise the exposure a little bit, maybe a little saturation, and what I'm trying to do is to match the right eye with the left eye. Let's try a little bit of blacks and whites to give a bit more contrast. Now we're all going to choose something slightly different, but I think I've made an improvement there. So once again, I'll hit Control 0 to fit the image back on screen. Now I would like to do a little work on the animal's face. I'm going to raise the tones a little bit more, I think, around the ears and in the white parts of the fur. I'm going to do that with a brush. We can pick that up from our mask. K is the shortcut key. What I'm going to do here is dial in a little bit of a change before I start to mask. So what I want to do is just raise the highlights a little bit. We can adjust these again later if we take too much, but you'll soon get a feel for how much you need to apply here. I think I should zoom in a little bit so we can see a bit more clearly. I'll make my brush an appropriate size, and there you can see as I touch into the image there, I'm raising those tones just nicely, and I would argue I'm not going too far. Let me drag over to the left hand side and do the same here. We don't need it quite as much there maybe. But there's also a couple of areas here, this one, where I can just lift the tones there. A little bit on the muzzle perhaps, because that's another very important point in the image and around the area below the nose. This area on the left, not a great deal needed there, just a little touch. And once again, I'll hit Control 0. And already we're getting quite a good image, as long as we can ignore those two light areas, one just to the bottom left and one at the top right. I'd still like to do maybe a little bit more work on the top edge, and looking at my image after a little while, I'd like to revisit my crop. Not unusual to do this, or not for me anyway. I think I would like to come up just a little more. A little more of an oblong shape there. Hit the Enter key, touch the G key, because I'm selecting now a graduated filter. Just going to put a little bit more density right at the top, not much, just a little bit to hold that top edge just a bit. Now I think we're probably worth having a 5-minute timeout, and this is where we just sit back, evaluate the image and consider if there's anything we want to do further with this image before we open it up into Photoshop. And there is one thing that's important. What I'd like to do is to zoom in, because we're going to look at dealing with the noise. So we'll look at that eye on the left hand side. You can see I've got this up to almost 200%, not quite. I'm going to go to my detail section and I'm going to click denoise. Once it appears, we'll select the area we want to view, and the area is the eye, and now we can see it there. What we're getting there is the default here is around about 50. What we're getting there is the default noise correction. When I click in here, we can see the before and after. Now, even though you're going to be viewing a slightly compressed video, I think you can see a phenomenal difference there. Not only is it dealing with the noise very well, but it's leaving the edges nicely sharp. Now, what setting we're going to use here is going to be personal, but I'm going to creep up just a little bit above 50, but not too much. Click Enhance and we see what's going on the right hand side. The image is actually being adjusted, I believe, up in the clouds and then returned to me. But if it's not, you can see it takes quite a while to apply that. But then when we look at the image, we can see we've still got really good quality, but we've got the noise adequately dealt with. Now at this point, I think I'm quite happy to open this up into Photoshop. Now I've opened this up into Photoshop's beta version because I want to take advantage of the AI Generative fill. To do that, I'm going to select my polygonal lasso tool. I'm going to draw a selection just up that area there to the edge and down and across. So I'm highlighting the area that I want the generative fill to repair. I'm going to click into the box. I don't need to type anything. I can just hit the Enter key. Now you can see that what's happening here is the image is definitely being taken up into the clouds. It's being worked on by the Photoshop supercomputer and it will be sent back down. There we see the result. It looks pretty good straight away, but we'll notice over the right here I've got 3 versions, so I can look and see which one I like best. I think the first one it gave me looks pretty good, and if I go back to my layers you can see it's even given me that on a separate layer. So I've still got my original image, and if we save this as a Photoshop file, we're not overwriting our original layer. But because of the nature of the result it's given me, I'm quite happy to move on to the top right. I'm going to do exactly the same there. I'm going to draw a line down just over the edge of the fur there, back up and around, and once again click into the generative fill and hit the Enter key. The only other thing I would want to do on this image is a little bit of strategic burning and maybe a little bit of strategic color. But let's see what the AI has done at the top right. Let me take a look at the other versions. I think out of all of them, I like the one on the right best of all, so at this point I would be saving this as a Photoshop file. But to speed things up, taking into account this is a video, I'm going to go straight to my layers here and flatten the image. Control 0 will bring it up nice and large on screen for me to do one or two little other final touches. So what I'd like to do first is a little bit of burning around the highlights in the image. So I'm going to go to my toolbox. I'm going to select the burn tool. I think I'll select probably mid-tones. I don't think the ones I'm going to try to deal with would be considered highlights. You can see I've got an exposure here of 50%. That's a bit too high, so I'm going to drop it somewhere around 10. I can adjust my brush, and I just want to darken these areas a little bit. You can just see the sort of areas I want to deal with. Not much, just a little bit of shading. Maybe a little bit down the bottom left, bottom right. We're all going to choose something slightly different, I think. But apart from that, I'm going to look at a little bit of strategic colour. When you look at the muzzle of the animal right in the important area of the frame there, a little bit more colour perhaps. Let's go back to the options and choose the sponge tool. I'm going to choose saturate from the options, and here I'm going to drop that down to about 10% or close to it. Square bracket keys to increase the size of the brush, because I just want to enhance a little bit of colour around the eyes and that strategic part of the face to try to encourage the viewers of our image to look right at those eyes as if they're not dramatic enough as they are. Now we could all choose to do something a little different. I could choose to darken the top edge a little more, the bottom edge. We're all going to do those sorts of things. But let's take a look at what we started with. Whether it's a conscious decision or not, we do tend to carry out a cost-benefit analysis on our images as we view the thumbnails. Will the time that I need to spend on the image be rewarded by a good result? Assuming, of course, that we do have the technical Photoshop skills needed. The artificial intelligence help we now get with generative fill, noise suppression and masks makes the answer to that question a resounding yes. The good news is that the image is all your own work. I'll see you next time.